everybody, my name is Traci Chen and welcome back to my channel, My Great Australian Dream. In this channel, we talk about all things migration, and today we're going to talk about the 186 visa. Now, there are two streams for this visa. The first one is called the Temporary Residence Transition Stream, and the second one is called the Direct Entry Stream. We will discuss the requirements for both. Now, just before I dive straight into this, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like my channel and share this with people who need it. And because Australian migration changes all the time, don't forget to turn those notifications on so you don't miss any changes. So the first stream that we'll talk about today is a Temporary Residence Transition Stream. We'll talk about the requirements for the visa applicant as well as the employer. Now, first of all, to be eligible for this visa, you must hold a bridging visa A, B, C, 457 visa or a TSS visa. You must be a holder of one of those visas. Any of the other visas, you wouldn't be eligible. Prior to lodging this visa, you must have worked for your employer for at least 3 years out of the last 4 years on a 457 or a TSS visa. And lastly, you must be nominated by an Australian employer and had that nomination approved within the last 6 months. So those are the basic requirements to even be able to lodge a 186 Temporary Residence Transition Stream visa. Let's have a look quickly at the requirements for the employer first. So first of all, there must be no adverse information about the business. So it must be operating legally and lawfully in Australia. Second of all, there needs to be a genuine need to fill this position. So for example, if there's a restaurant that needs to employ a chef, there needs to be a genuine position available. Right now, it is pretty easy to prove this because there is a huge demand, a huge shortage for chefs here in Australia because borders are being closed. We used to get a lot of chefs internationally. There's a huge shortage of chefs across a lot of restaurants in Australia. So that would be pretty easy to prove, in my opinion. So for example, there's a restaurant and they want to lodge a 186 Temporary Residence Transition Stream visa for their chef. First of all, they must have previously already employed this chef for the last 3 years out of the last 4 years in the position of a chef to be able to lodge this. Now, not all occupations are actually eligible for this stream. You first have to check that your occupation is on the eligible skilled occupation list, which is usually the medium term list. Now, there's hundreds on there, but to give you an example, it would be chefs. Cooks are not on the list. Accountants, some engineers, and IT professionals. Not all IT professionals are on there. So it's very important that you have a look at the occupation list and make sure that you have an eligible occupation to be able to lodge this. So again, just remember, you must have previously already been working for this employer for the last 3 years at least on a 457 or a TSS visa. To lodge this visa, your employer must pay the fees associated with lodging this. So it might be the legal fees, it'd be the nomination fee, as well as the Skilled Australian Fund levy. Now, the cost of the levy does vary depending on the size of the business. So to give you an example, if the business has an annual turnover of less than $10 million, then they must pay a fee of $3,000, and that's a once-off fee. If the business has an annual turnover of over $10 million, then they must pay an annual fee of $5,000. Again, that is once off. The nomination fee is $540 if it's in like metropolitan areas of Australia, and it's actually free if it's in a regional place in Australia. So for the employer, as long as they were the most recent sponsor for the 457 or 482 visa for the employee, they would be eligible. However, it's very important that you do obtain the right migration and legal advice for this because it actually gets really complicated. There's a lot of things you need to look into. I've just provided you with a high-level explanation, but please make sure you get the proper advice. This video is to be used as a general guide only. I get a lot of questions about COVID concessions. So for example, during COVID times in 2020 and 2021, a lot of businesses were shut. There are some concessions that are available, such as if you had reduced hours of work. You do need to provide evidence of it, but you may be able to get a concession for it. But generally speaking, the requirement is 3 years full-time in the last 4 years before you apply for this visa. And the occupation must be on the eligible occupation list. Now that I've given you a very high-level overview, let's talk about the requirements for the actual visa applicant, so the employee. So obviously you must have the relevant qualifications and skills in the nominated occupation. So for example, if you're an accountant, you generally need to have an accounting degree. plus the relevant work experience. For example, if you're a mechanical engineer, you generally need to have a Bachelor of Engineering majoring in mechanical. You must have the relevant licensing or registration to perform this job. So in Australia, there are some jobs that require licensing. For example, a nurse. For example, a doctor. You would need to have ARPRO registration. So you must have that before you apply. There are jobs that don't require licensing. For example, a chef. Next, you must have the relevant work experience. And how that work experience is counted under the temporary residence transition stream is that your employer, your approved sponsor, must have actually employed you for at least 3 years out of the last 4 years in that occupation. So you were employed as an accountant for the last 3 years by the same employer for the last 4 years. That work experience must be full-time. Again, there's certain COVID concessions, so there's certain things you can look at for that. And most importantly, you must be under 45 at the time that you apply. So you can't be 45 years old, you have to be 44 years old in 11 months, for example. Must be under that age limit. There is certain exemptions that apply to the age limit. I won't go into them on detail, but I'll leave a link below so you can have a look at them. But you could perhaps get an exemption for the age limit if, for example, you're an academic in a university, or maybe you're a medical practitioner. There's certain exemptions that you can look at for that. Next, it's very important and mandatory for you to have the minimum English level, which is competent English. That's equivalent to minimum 6 in each band for IELTS, or if you're doing PTE, it's minimum 50 in each band for the PTE. And remember, it's minimum in each band, not an overall score. And then also lastly, you must also meet the relevant health and character checks. So you have to have good health and good character. Next, let's talk about the direct entry stream. So it's the same visa, but different stream essentially. They're both permanent resident visas, but different requirements to qualify for it. So first of all, the basic requirements for any applicant: you must have an occupation on the eligible occupation list. Again, it's usually the medium-term occupation list. You must have at least 3 years post-qualification work experience, and that work experience must be full-time. And you must have a positive skills assessment. Now, skills assessments are used all the time in skilled visas. It depends on what your occupation is. So for example, if you're an accountant, your skills will be assessed by IPA or CPA. If you're an engineer, your skills is usually assessed by Engineers Australia. And for example, if you're a registered nurse, then your skills assessment is usually assessed by ANMAC. Before we talk about the requirements for the applicant in details, let's take a step back and look at the requirements for an employer. It's actually quite simple for an employer. As an employer, we don't really recommend going straight into direct entry. I only do it if there's a very large business, it's very easy to prove, and there's a genuine actually need for it. Otherwise, we usually start them off on a 482 because it's really hard to explain. If it's just a normal small to medium business, if they need the employees so bad, what's the difference between lodging a 482 for them? Why must you lodge a 186? Because once the 186 is approved, it's permanent resident. And although they're supposed to work for you for at least 2 years, they're technically not bounded by anything. If they wanted or needed to leave, they essentially could. So it's very important to consider those factors before diving deep into a 186 direct entry application. A lot of people are very keen to do it, but again, I cannot stress enough, get the proper migration and legal advice around this because there's lots of requirements. I am just doing a very high level kind of guide for you guys because a lot of people are interested in this visa. So the requirements for this visa, it must be a lawfully operating business in Australia. There must be no adverse information about it. So for example, an adverse information would be if the employer has sponsored some 457s before and there were some issues with the employment, they may have been barred from sponsorship for like a couple of years. That happens actually quite a lot. Some things just fall through the gaps for the employer, and that would actually equate to adverse information. So you'd have to wait until that sponsorship bar is lifted before you could actually lodge an application. Again, you must prove that there's a genuine need to employ the employee. And again, you must pay the Skilled Australian Fund Levy, which I explained previously. You must offer the position for at least 2 years. So when you lodge this visa, this position must be available for at least the next 2 years. Super important. And the occupation must be on the eligible occupation list. I'll actually leave a link below so you guys can have a look at the eligible occupations. Now, this is not absolutely mandatory, but we always advise it. It's always good for the employer to put up a couple of job ads like they do for the 482 visa on Job Active or, say Seek, and advertise for the position. I think it goes a long way to prove the genuine position, because if you advertise it and all the CVs come in and they're not qualified for the job, it's great evidence. So, the requirements for the visa applicant. Once you've already established that you have an eligible occupation, the next you need to prove is that you have the relevant work experience, which is 3 years post-qualification full-time work experience. So for example, if I'm an accountant, I studied a Bachelor of Accounting, then after I finish my degree, I must have 3 years full-time work experience as an accountant to be eligible for this visa. I wouldn't be eligible if I had say 1.5 years as a bookkeeper and then, another 1.5 years as an accountant. That wouldn't meet the requirements. The jobs are very, very different. Next, you must have the relevant licensing and registration for this job and for this occupation, just as I explained before. And you must have a positive skills assessment. So if I'm an accountant, I would put together my degree, my transcript, my 3 years of paid full-time work experience and send that off to IPA to be assessed. Once that comes back with a tick for all of them, I'd be ready to almost lodge this visa. You must be under the age of 45 before you apply. And you obviously must meet the health and character requirements. So you can't have a criminal record. And of course, you must have the minimum requirement of competent English. As I explained before, 6 in each band for IELTS. So lastly, if you guys do lodge a nomination and then the visa for this 186, whether it be direct entry or temporary residence transition, once it is granted, you are an Australian permanent resident. When you do lodge this visa, you are expected to continue to work for at least 2 years in that position for the same employer. And I think it's a great thing to do. I always recommend this to my clients. The employer has spent this money and spent the time into doing it. It is the right thing to do. However, if something does go wrong or, life happens and you have to move on from the job, it is possible. I don't recommend it though. So I hope that video was really helpful. Thank you so much for watching. As explained, it's a very high level kind of general guide of the requirements. I can't stress enough, with such an important application, it's really important that you get a migration agent or a migration lawyer to actually help you lodge this application, because there's a lot of things they need to look at. But this would give you a good idea of, oh yeah, I may be or may not be eligible for this. Or it gives you a good idea of what you need to work towards if it is the visa you want to apply for. As I said before, we'll be trying to do 1 to 2 videos at least every week. So feel free to just add in the comments what visas you want to hear about next. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.